So our final passage that we want to look at this week is Acts chapter 6. Now this is a story that maybe doesn't get a lot of play. It's certainly not as well known as the birth narrative of Jesus and the Magnificat of Mary. In Acts chapter 6, you have the beginnings of the biggest theological crisis of the new church. Right? So I mentioned the exile as the major theological crisis of the Old Testament that extends into the New Testament. It impacts this next crisis that I'm going to talk about, but it's not exactly the same. The next crisis, the big crisis, and I think I've talked about this in another video as well, the big theological crisis in the New Testament, kind of the New Testament, but in the age of the church after Jesus ascends back to heaven. The big theological crisis is, what are we going to do with the Gentiles? Gentiles begin coming to faith in Jesus, and do we need to make these Gentiles? Now remember, the church is Jewish at the beginning of the book of Acts. It's like 100% Jewish. Do we need to make these Gentiles who are all of a sudden coming to faith, in Jesus, do we need to make them become Jews in addition to becoming people who follow Jesus? And in Acts chapter 6, you have a few of these folks. They are women. Love the way Luke and Acts, this writer uses women to move the story of Jesus and his disciples forward. It's masterful. And it also communicates something about the importance of women. Maybe something that theologians have not always paid attention to the degree that they should. That is changing, has changed, and is continuing to change. But these women who are widows in Acts chapter 6 are also Hellenist. And what that means is they're Greek, right? And so they are Greek people, ethnically, or the writer could be using that kind of expansively to talk about anybody who's not Jewish, but I don't necessarily think that's what's going on here. Anyway, these are Greek-speaking women who are not ethnically Jewish, who became Jewish by religion and then became Christians. And in the beginnings of this New Testament church, we find that one of the things that's going on is they're trying to take care of their poor. This is the message of Jesus. It's certainly the message of the prophets, and we find the apostles in the beginning of the New Testament church trying to figure out how to care for the poor. And so these Hellenistic women, these Greek women who are converts to Judaism and then converts to Christianity, they're not getting as much to eat. And they come to the apostles and say, and make their complaint, right? And the apostles respond by appointing 7 men to deal with the distribution of food, because it is indeed important. And it's important in 2 ways. One, it's important because people need to be fed. But the subtext, what's going on here, is a communication that everybody is welcome. All the communicants are welcome at meal, at table, at fellowship. And in this way, early in the church's history, it is established, and we have not necessarily been very good at this throughout the last 2,000 years, but it is established in Acts chapter 6 that this community is to be a community that is welcoming to women and men. It is a community that is to be open to people of all ethnic and racial makeup. That is who we are to be. We are to be fair then. I don't get more food because I'm Jewish and a Christian, nor do I get less food because I'm a Gentile and a Christian. Equity is equity is equity, and that is a justice issue. Now, that can be applied to any number of conversations. It can certainly be applied to socioeconomic issues. It can be applied to healthcare issues. It can be applied to criminal justice issues. It can be applied to social welfare issues. It can be applied across the landscape of the helping professions. How do we deal with those who have less? And what is the mandate, and how, especially for institutions like Azusa Pacific University, when we talk about being a community of learners together who honor God first, what does that mean? And equity, justice, mercy seems to be at the heart and soul of that to me. So, what have we talked about? A little concluding. So I'm wrapping in the week's conclusion in with this Acts chapter 6 conversation. We talked about justice as being relational. We talked about justice in favor of the poor. Justice being based on what's right rather than how much money one has. Justice based on the way God does things and wants us to do things. Justice balanced with mercy, or mercy balanced with justice. Justice as God's setting things right. So, looking forward to the end of the book, the poor, who were many of the Christians. I mean, the Christian world today in some ways looks very different in the West anyway, in socioeconomic status in some quarters than it did in the first century. So how would a poor person respond to the imagery in the book of Revelation of golden streets, of gates of pearl, of jeweled walls? What would that look like for the poor? They would see that when I enter into the kingdom of God, I enter into this kind of blessing of God, and the limitations that I have in this life of poverty fade away. I am not proclaiming a kind of self-help kind of gospel here. I'm saying that the playing field, when God sets things right, the playing field is equal. So as you think about this justice issue, ask yourself, how does my practice area currently think about justice? What do I think about justice because of my practice area? What do I think about retributive justice? What do I think about justice and mercy? How am I going to walk that out? Where do I disagree with Ragsdale? Where do I agree with him? All those kinds of questions, I think, are helpful as we think about this justice issue. And feel free. Once again, feel free to disagree with me. Feel free to say, I think you've missed it on some things. Feel free to think your own thoughts. My goal is not to make you think my thoughts, although, they are my thoughts and I'm kind of committed to them. But my goal is to help you to think through and see how a theological conversation may impact or does impact your own practice area. Okay, I'll see you next week.